policy. And that's important because 62% of emissions in the United States are from the corporate sector. And for that reason, WWF got together with some important private sector partners and analyzed that corporate sector and said, how far can the corporate sector get in reducing emissions consistent with what the science would require of us as a country, as the United States, and as a developed country, what the IPCC says is the appropriate level of reductions for the United States. So you can see here the trajectory that would bring U.S. emissions under a carbon budget consistent with what the IPCC has said that developed countries should do. And then if we just take that slice from 2010 to 2020, what we did is we looked at what should that trajectory be, and then how much of that trajectory, how much of those emissions reductions could be achieved through net present value positive investments from the private sector. And I can tell you what we thought we would learn from that study was that there would be a gap between what the corporate sector was able to do using traditional investments that meet NPV positive guidelines and what the science requires. But instead what we found was that 100% of that emissions reduction budget that should be allocated to the private sector in the United States could be met through NPV positive investments. And in fact, in the process, that $780 billion of savings of profit could be achieved by the corporate sector in meeting those commitments. And I think that one of the things that we wanted to do as part of that analysis was to turn on its head the idea that climate change is a burden, it's a responsibility, it's something that will require you to sacrifice, and instead say, if there's $780 billion worth of profit to be achieved, how should that profit be allocated? What sectors of the economy should we expect to chase that profit because more of it is there for them? This last slide shows you the allocation across different sectors of the economy of the profit potential and how that relates to GHG emission reduction possibilities. But the other thing that we wanted to do is we wanted to see if we could come up with a roadmap that showed the steps that the private sector could take in order to achieve this profit potential. And what we found was a set of interventions that started with a company setting a target to reduce its emissions, looking closely at what it could achieve to get onto that science-based trajectory, and then the steps that could get them there. And you can see here the 5 steps of that process as McKinsey and our partners and WWF developed. And I think that, as I said, at the core of that is setting ambitious emissions reduction targets. So one of the things that that report did is it came up with a tool that would help companies look at their portfolio of potential growth within the sector, the places for emissions reduction opportunities, and then helping the company develop a target that could really drive innovation within the company. And the first step along the way is improving your energy management, and as a consequence of that, cutting energy waste and saving money. So you just can see an example of one of the companies that we've been working with and the progress they've made in cutting energy waste and saving money in the process. The second part of that trajectory is increasing the supplies of renewable energy, which are becoming more and more cost competitive, though I would say that first step on the path is really the one where most of the cost savings can be achieved. But we're seeing more and more opportunities within renewables, and that's, of course, one of the topics we're going to talk about today. But what we found is the challenge, and it's a challenge in the United States, it's also a challenge in India, as I understand, to begin to simplify the process for companies to begin to switch to renewable energy, to make that the new normal. And what that requires is more than just what companies can do inside their own businesses, the things they control, but it requires larger changes within the system. So this is an example of what we call a big box store like Walmart in the United States. They can achieve maybe about 30% of their energy needs through on-site renewable energy. But even with a lot of energy efficiency improvements, still 70% of their energy on average is going to have to come from the grid. So that means we need to fix the grid. So from that, WWF, together with some of our partners like WRI and the Business Sustainability Roundtable, brought together some companies that are in the renewable energy the business of acquiring renewable energy, and we said, what challenges are you facing as you try to scale up towards 100% renewables? And then how can you, what are some of the solutions that we could develop together to tackle those challenges? And that has led to this, in the United States, something called the Corporate Renewable Energy Buyers Principles, which is a manifesto of changes that companies have come up with themselves through a convening process that we helped create, that sets forward the changes that they want to see in the renewables sector from utilities, from regulators, from the government, and calls for those changes to be made. And the power of bringing companies together as a coalition and speaking with one voice is significant. It's very significant in the United States in terms of the way you bring political change about. As I said before, climate change is politically challenging in the United States, but when you have major companies standing together with a huge amount of market capitalization saying we want to make these changes, then that creates the political space for the government to do what it should do. And these, this coalition is starting to get a good amount of attention. I think that, sorry, I went too fast there. I think that one of the tests, though, of whether this idea of driving renewable energy deployment through corporate purchases is whether we're seeing those corporate purchases actually happen, and whether that's making a meaningful dent in the needs to scale up renewable energy. And what you can see here, if it's probably the print is too small for you to see all the slices, but these are individual procurement contracts that have been signed by companies in the United States. Many of them are members of the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance that I just mentioned, and you can see how we're seeing a real step change in the amount of these purchases, and this level of effort that we saw last year in 2015, if it were to maintain over the course of the next 10 years, we would hit the goal that we've set to more than double corporate renewable procurement in the United States, and that would result in about an additional 10% of emissions reductions across the economy in the US. So if we go back to this, the path or the roadmap of engagement, of corporate climate stewardship, the last piece of that is engagement with the public, helping to change the narrative. And this is especially important in the United States, but it might also be important in India. I'd be interested in hearing from you about this. But what we saw on the road to Paris was, and this is also something that WWF worked with our corporate partners to produce, was a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal where over 100 companies in the United States called on the President of the United States to go to Paris and to sign an ambitious agreement. And they said it within the context of the businesses that will drive that new economy, and saying we are prepared to be part of the transition to the low-carbon future that Paris should set the trajectory for. And I think, again, sort of having that sort of political wind behind our policymakers, pushing them to do more is critical. It's critical in the United States, it may be here in India. And then I was excited to see, and of course we were part of it, that this coalition speaking again yesterday, just before the signing of the Paris Agreement. And again, in this case, the coalition is even larger than it was ahead of Paris, but calling on the President of the United States and other world leaders to sign the Paris Agreement, and for the United States to take the steps that it needs to on policy to make sure the U.S. meets the commitments that it's put on the table in Paris. So I think keeping that sense of engagement from the private sector, that sense of the private sector sort of aligning with a science-based vision for tackling climate change is critical. So as WWF, we're proud of the work that we've done with the private sector. This is a mapping of NGOs in the United States that was done by corporate sustainability executives. And again, the print is too small for you to see, but at the far right of the graph, where the NGOs that have the most credibility and influence are located, that's WWF there, circled in black. So this has been something that's been a big part of what we've done in the United States, but it's also a big part of what we do here in India. We do it slightly differently so far, but really focused on innovation and supporting the small and medium-sized enterprises that are emerging with the new solutions in India that are needed to tackle this problem. So through the Climate Solver platform, and we're very proud to be working with CII and others to make that platform even bigger and more impactful, we're helping to take innovators that have made it to the pilot stage and help to move them through the chain to scale up their business through better business planning, finance, and other steps to success. So I want to end there and just, again, thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to a conversation. I think that the lesson for us is that the private sector is leading in the United States. I would say the private sector is an important part of the solution in India, but we need the private sector to do even more, because this challenge is bigger than any one of us, any one business, any one country. So we're relying on your leadership. I'm confident that you're up to the task. And we, as WWF, look forward to collaborating with you as you lead us into this new future. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think, thanks, Leonard. I think it's a wonderful experience that you have shared from US and how private sector is getting involved in US with the companies giving their agenda to the president over there. And I think in the session we have two more panelists. On my left is Mr. Guha. I would like to introduce him and then request him to put forward his views from Indian perspective. Mr. Guha is master's from IIM Calcutta, and also he is a graduate from IIT Kharagpur. He is working in the advisory services of EY for last 12 years and specializes in climate change and sustainability strategy, reporting, assurance, due diligence, and climate change advisory. His experience is over 18 years, and I think he will share his experiences under this banner of environmental services, that how climate change services could be enhanced in India.
Thank you, Shikhar. Thank you, Lou, for a wonderful backdrop to this particular session. With the time constraints in mind, I won't keep a very long kind of a lecture and hold you back before lunch. Maybe we can have some time for discussion after we are through with the sessions for the two of us. So primarily, I'd like to highlight something about the renewable energy sector and its role, some of the things that we are seeing in the market. So broadly touching upon some of the aspects that I think may be of interest to you. So the one aspect that's very clear to this August audience is definitely the benefits from the climate change aspect, benefits from the point of view of carbon footprint reduction. So carbon dioxide reduction is one of the obvious impacts or the mitigation impacts of propagating renewable energy throughout, I mean, in any part of the world, and as well as in India as well. So if we look at the two aspects of mitigation and adaptation, we see that there are benefits of renewable energy in both these prongs. I mean, in mitigation, it is very obvious. I mean, if you introduce renewable energy replacing fossil fuels, you reduce the carbon footprint related to that. And with the India's 175 gigawatt plan by 2022, we have approximately an estimate of around 325 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent reduction, just because of this renewable energy introduction by 2022. Now, some of the other adaptation benefits also which are associated with it, here I would like to cite an example of Hurricane Sandy, which happened in the USA, where we saw that some of the renewable energy sources that withstood the climatic impact, the Hurricane Sandy itself, and came back to life much faster than the thermal power sources. So this quick comeback or quick connection back with the grid, that is one of the biggest advantages of renewable energy sector. We ourselves did a study in Bangladesh for one of the SEZs, where we saw that there were certain things that there were in the recommendation, in the suggestions. The solar power and LEDs were kind of recommended. When we went back maybe 3 years later, in 2015, we saw that the feedback that we were getting from the people, they were